The prairie wind was sharp that afternoon, rattling through dry grass and whistling across the open land. Dust clung to every crevice, filling the air with a weary heaviness. Along the winding dirt road, a lone figure trudged forward, a young woman, barely more than a girl in years, though hardship had etched itself upon her face. Her steps were uneven, her shoes worn thin, and each breath seemed to come with effort. Hunger had hollowed her cheeks, and the faint tremor in her hands betrayed how long it had been since her last proper meal. Her dress, once respectable calico, was torn at the hem and frayed at the sleeves. She clutched a faded shawl around her shoulders, pulling it tight against the wind as if it could shield her from more than just the cold. Beneath her bonnet, stray strands of hair had escaped, falling across her face. She brushed them back with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the horizon in search of shelter. At last, in the distance, she caught sight of it. A lonely ranch tucked between rolling hills, its silhouette standing stubborn against the empty landscape. A weather-beaten barn leaned slightly with age, and smoke curled faintly from the chimney of a modest farmhouse. The sight stirred a flicker of hope within her chest. Maybe, just maybe, someone there would take pity. By the time she reached the ranch gate, her legs felt ready to give out. She paused, gathering what little courage she had left. Turning back wasn't an option. She had no place to return to. Every step forward had been fueled by the memory of doors slammed in her face, the sting of harsh words from strangers who saw only a beggar, not a soul in need. Yet, despite the shame burning in her heart, she lifted her hand and knocked softly on the farmhouse door. It creaked open after a long moment, revealing a tall figure shadowed by the dim interior. His presence filled the doorway, broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze as words rushed out before fear could silence her. "Sir," she whispered, voice raw with desperation, "I don't ask for charity. Please, let me work. I'll clean your barn, scrub your floors, mend what I can, only for a plate of food." Her words trembled in the air, fragile as glass, as if the slightest breeze might shatter them. She braced herself for rejection, for the familiar sting of being turned away, perhaps even mocked. But still she stood there, hands twisting her shawl, her pride already surrendered to survival. In that instant, something remarkable filled the silence. Though she felt invisible to most of the world, her plea carried a strength born of desperation. It was not only her stomach that hungered, but also her spirit, starved for kindness, for a place to belong, for the simple dignity of being useful. Behind her, the wind tugged at her shawl, carrying the faint smell of earth and wood smoke. Before her, the ranch stood quiet, a place that could mean either salvation or another bitter disappointment. She held her breath, waiting for the man's reply, praying he would not close the door in her face. The man who stood in the doorway was no stranger to hardship. His name was Jacob Callahan, though few ever used it anymore. Folks in town simply called him the rancher out on Hollow Creek, a man who kept to himself, who spoke little, and whose life had been pared down to work and survival since the day grief hollowed him out. His ranch was his burden and his lifeline, kept alive by the calloused strength of his own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to give up the land his father had built. He had expected no one at his door that day, especially not a slip of a girl with desperation etched into her every movement. When he pulled the heavy wooden door open, prepared to tell off some wandering peddler or idle drifter, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Her face, pale and drawn, bore the kind of hunger that went beyond the belly. It was the hunger of someone who had been denied kindness too long. Her eyes, wide and pleading, carried shadows of exhaustion, yet held a strange, unyielding spark. It was that spark, faint but unmistakable, that rooted him where he stood. And then, the words tumbled from her lips. "I'll clean your barn for just a plate of food." Jacob froze. His chest tightened as though unseen hands had reached inside and squeezed. It wasn't her request that struck him so, nor the desperation in her tone. He'd seen beggars and wanderers enough in town to know that song well. What undid him was something deeper, something uncanny. For in the pale, wind-chapped face before him, he caught an echo of another face, his late wife's. It was in the way her eyes tilted slightly at the corners, in the determined set of her jaw despite her trembling. Though his wife Clara had been older when she passed, stronger and more sure of herself, the resemblance was undeniable. Like a ghost rising from memory, it stole the breath from his lungs. For a long moment, he said nothing. The girl shifted uneasily, mistaking his silence for rejection. She clutched her shawl tighter as though bracing for the door to be slammed. He should have spoken, should have told her to move along, that he had troubles enough without taking in strays. But his tongue felt heavy, locked in place by the storm of memory. Clara had been gone 5 years. 5 long, bone-weary years in which laughter had not once touched his lips. He had buried himself in cattle, in mending fences, in the endless cycle of planting and reaping. Yet now, standing on his porch, looking into the eyes of this stranger, the wound of her loss bled anew. Finally, he managed to clear his throat, though his voice came rough. You said the barn?" She nodded quickly, hope flickering across her features. "Yes, sir. I can sweep it, tidy it, mend broken things. Anything if you'll spare me a plate." Her humility twisted at his heart. This was no swindler or lazy drifter looking for an easy handout. This was someone who had scraped bottom and still clung to dignity by offering work first. He could almost hear Clara's voice in his memory. "Jacob, don't harden so much that you forget mercy. He should have shut the door." He should have told her to go to town, to seek help elsewhere. Instead, he stepped back, motioning her inside with a stiffness that betrayed his turmoil. "Bread," he muttered, gesturing toward the table. "Eat some bread first, then the barn." And as she passed him, carrying the scent of dust and the faintest hint of lavender long faded from her clothes, Jacob Callahan remained frozen in the doorway, staring after her, not just at a stranger who had asked for food, but at the haunting reminder of a love he had thought buried forever. The next morning, the ranch woke with the muted sounds of labor, the low neigh of horses, the soft rustle of hay, and the faint creak of wagon wheels in the distance. The girl, whose name Jacob had yet to learn, had already begun her work before the sun fully rose. Her hands, small yet calloused from hardship, moved quickly, sweeping the barn with precision and care. Each stroke of the broom seemed to carry her determination, as though cleaning was not just a chore but a lifeline. Jacob watched from the doorway, arms folded, trying to reconcile the image before him. Here was a fragile figure, weary and hungry, yet she moved with a focus and diligence that few men could match. She straightened bent nails, gathered scattered hay, and even attempted to repair broken boards with crude tools she found in the barn. Her resolve was so tangible that it seemed to fill the space, transforming the old, dim barn into something almost alive with purpose. After some time, he cleared his throat, the sound breaking the rhythm of her work. She paused, hands gripping the broom tightly, eyes wide and wary. Jacob's gaze softened, but it was tinged with unease. He was a man used to solitude and routine, unaccustomed to the presence of another soul, especially one who stirred something long buried. "You work hard," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "I'll let you stay. 1 plate of food a day. You keep to the chores I give you. No more, no less." Her relief was immediate and visible. She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, though she still seemed unsure if the offer was genuine or if she would be turned away at the first misstep. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with gratitude. "I'll do anything you need." "Thank you." It was a strange kind of bargain, not one born of trust but necessity. Jacob needed hands to keep the ranch alive. She needed food to survive. Yet even within the practicality of the agreement, something unspoken lingered, a fragile thread of mutual respect. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering labor. He wasn't giving freely. He was preserving the dignity of both parties in a way only unspoken necessity could dictate. As the days passed, the rhythm of their arrangement began to solidify. Morning light found her feeding the animals, brushing the horses' coats, and repairing fences. Evenings were spent scrubbing floors, tending the tool shed, or patching worn saddles. Every task she undertook, she did with the intensity of someone who had learned early that survival demanded more than effort. It demanded excellence, even in the smallest chores. Jacob, for his part, found himself observing her more than directing her. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when a problem was solved, how she spoke softly to the animals as if trying to coax life back into them, and the quiet determination in her movements that suggested a past filled with struggle yet tempered by resilience. Each day, he caught himself forgetting to issue commands, instead marveling at her skill and dedication. And yet the memory of his late wife lingered. Every time she bent to sweep a corner or adjust a beam, Jacob was reminded of Clara's own meticulous care, her attention to detail, and the quiet strength she had once brought to the ranch. It was a memory that both comforted and unsettled him, filling him with a sense of nostalgia and a silent yearning he had long thought buried. By the end of the week, a strange equilibrium had settled over the ranch. The girl had proven her worth beyond mere labor. She had begun to earn Jacob's trust, even if he did not yet recognize it fully. And for her, the plate of food at the end of the day was more than nourishment. It was a symbol that she belonged somewhere, that her existence had meaning beyond survival. The bargain had been struck, but neither fully understood the depth of what had begun. It was more than an exchange of labor for sustenance. It was the tentative beginning of a connection that would slowly grow, challenging the walls of grief and isolation that Jacob had built around himself and offering the girl a chance at hope she had never dared to imagine. Night fell softly over the ranch, draping the rolling fields in shadows and silvery moonlight. The wind carried a chill that seeped through the gaps in the farmhouse walls, rustling the old curtains and setting the lanterns flickering. Inside, Jacob sat at the wooden table, a mug of lukewarm tea in hand, staring into the amber liquid as though it might offer some answer to the unease stirring within him. The girl had finished her work hours ago. Retreating to the corner of the kitchen with a plate of steaming stew, she ate in silence, careful not to make a sound, as if her very presence were something to be tolerated rather than embraced. Yet her eyes, bright despite exhaustion, kept darting toward Jacob, searching for signs of judgment, or perhaps a hint of approval. Jacob, however, was lost in a fog of memory. Each flicker of the lantern seemed to summon visions of Clara, his late wife. He remembered her voice, soft and warm, calling him in for supper after long days in the fields. He remembered the way she tended the barn, her hands steady even when sweat and dirt coated them, and how her laughter had once filled the quiet spaces of the ranch like sunlight spilling across the land. The resemblance he had noticed in the girl earlier that morning now consumed his thoughts. In her perseverance, in her gentle determination, he saw echoes of Clara, not a replacement but a reflection, a shadow that brought both comfort and a sharp pang of sorrow. The silence of the kitchen was almost deafening. Jacob's eyes, once trained to note every detail of his property and livestock, now noticed the smallest movements of the girl. The way she carefully folded her hands after finishing her meal, the slight tremor in her shoulders from fatigue, the way her eyes lingered on him for approval, all of it stirred memories that were supposed to be long buried. He found himself questioning the fairness of life, why it had taken Clara from him, why it had left him to wrestle with the emptiness of the ranch, and now, inexplicably, why it had sent this young stranger into his life at the very moment he had stopped expecting anything new. He leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. The ranch had been his sanctuary and his prison, a place where grief had quietly seeped into every corner. Nights had been the hardest, filled with loneliness so palpable it pressed against his chest like a physical weight. Yet now, with the girl's quiet presence nearby, the weight seemed less oppressive, though it came with its own tension. Her innocence, her desperation, and her courage, qualities he hadn't realized he longed to witness again, stirred emotions he had not felt in years. Protectiveness, hope, even a tentative sense of joy. Jacob realized he was no longer simply observing a worker fulfilling her bargain. She had awakened something dormant inside him, a reminder of the love and companionship he had once known. But with that awakening came uncertainty and fear. He feared the past, feared the echoes of Clara's memory, feared that allowing himself to care, even in small ways, would leave him vulnerable to pain once more. Outside, the wind moaned through the rafters of the barn, carrying the scent of hay and earth. Inside, the fire crackled faintly, a soft reminder that life still persisted, that survival still mattered. The girl, finishing her meal, quietly washed her plate and set it by the sink. Without a word, she retreated to the small loft at the back of the house where she slept, leaving Jacob alone with the memories that haunted him and the present that challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he finally rose from the table, stretching stiff muscles and tired bones, Jacob understood that this encounter was more than coincidence. The girl had arrived at his door at a moment when his life felt empty, her presence forcing him to confront grief, loneliness, and the possibility of connection once more. He carried the knowledge that the past would always linger, but perhaps for the first time in years, the future might hold something new, a fragile promise that life, even after loss, could still offer moments of warmth, trust, and hope. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, each sunrise bringing work, and each sunset bringing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. The girl, whose name Jacob finally learned was Eliza, had become an integral part of the ranch's daily operations, though neither she nor Jacob would have admitted it aloud. Her presence was subtle but undeniable. She moved with a careful grace, tending to the animals and chores with meticulous precision, and in doing so, began to chip away at the walls Jacob had built around himself over the years. It was during one of those early mornings that their fragile friendship began to take shape. Jacob had been out in the barn, repairing a fence post that had been loosened by a recent storm. Eliza, carrying a bucket of fresh water for the horses, lingered near the doorway, hesitant to interrupt. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost cautious. "Sir, do you want me to help with that?" she asked, gesturing to the stubborn post. Jacob paused, wiping sweat from his brow and looking at her. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, not at the offer of help, but at the earnestness in her tone. You can handle the hammer," he replied slowly, unsure if he meant it as instruction or permission. Eliza nodded, stepping forward with care. She had learned to watch, to observe, and to act with precision. Her hands, small yet steady, gripped the tools as though she were performing a ritual she had been trained for all her life. Jacob found himself quietly admiring her skill and determination, a feeling unfamiliar to him but deeply comforting. He realized that this was more than just labor. This was trust, and it was being extended to him in a way that demanded respect. By mid-morning, the fence was repaired, and a quiet understanding had begun to form between them. They did not speak much of themselves. Eliza was reticent about her past, and Jacob had long ago stopped sharing his, but their shared work created a bond that neither could deny. In the barn, amid the smell of hay and leather, there was a subtle exchange of trust, a communication of effort and acknowledgement that needed no words. Over the next few days, small gestures continued to solidify this fragile friendship. Jacob found a way to leave a steaming cup of tea by her plate when he noticed her fatigue. Eliza, in turn, would take care to mend a tear in his old work gloves or quietly sweep the dust from the windows so that sunlight could warm the house. These actions, simple as they seemed, were heavy with significance. Each one was a signal of care, a thread weaving a connection that neither fully understood yet both were drawn to. Despite the growing closeness, a shadow of caution lingered. Jacob's grief was still raw, and he was wary of letting anyone too close. He had lost too much and feared the vulnerability that companionship demanded. Eliza, though resilient, carried her own scars. Trust had been a luxury she could not afford until now. Each smile, each gesture of kindness was measured, tentative, a test of the other's intentions. One evening, as the sky bled gold and amber into twilight, they found themselves seated on the porch steps, watching the sun dip behind distant hills. Eliza broke the silence, her voice barely above the wind. "I like it here. The ranch, it's peaceful." Jacob nodded, unsure if he was responding to her words or to the quiet realization that he, too, felt a rare comfort in her presence. "It is," he admitted, the single word carrying more weight than either of them could express. In that moment, the foundation of a fragile friendship had been laid. It was tentative, formed of shared labor and small gestures of care, but it was there, a beginning, fragile yet steadfast, hinting at something that might grow into trust, loyalty, and perhaps even more. Both Jacob and Eliza sensed the potential, even if they dared not speak it aloud. In the solitude of the ranch, amid the quiet hum of work and the gentle glow of evening, a connection had begun. It was unspoken, delicate yet undeniable, the kind of bond that could survive hardships, weather storms, and perhaps begin to heal the wounds each of them carried. The ranch had settled into a fragile calm. Jacob and Eliza, though still cautious with one another, had found a rhythm in their days. Morning chores were shared, meals were eaten in relative silence, and evenings often ended with both of them sitting quietly by the fire, the warmth filling spaces words could not. Yet beneath the peace, an unease began to stir, one that neither of them could ignore for long. It began on a routine supply trip to town. Jacob hadn't wanted to take Eliza with him. She was still too thin, her face too pale, and there was something in her demeanor that suggested she wasn't ready to face the prying eyes of strangers. But Eliza had insisted. "I can help carry things," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, and Jacob, against his better judgment, had relented. The town was small, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings gathered around a single dusty street. It was a place where news traveled faster than the wind and secrets rarely stayed buried. Jacob led the way to the general store, nodding curtly at familiar faces, while Eliza kept close, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Inside, the store smelled of grain and tobacco. Eliza busied herself stacking supplies into a basket, while Jacob haggled with the shopkeeper. It was then, as she passed near the shelves of dry goods, that she overheard two men talking in low, conspiratorial voices near the counter. "Word is, she ran off not 2 weeks ago," one man muttered, his voice gruff. "Belonged to a couple over by the Eastern Ridge. Folks say they paid for her, fair and square." The other replied, spitting into a tin by his feet. "If she's around here, they'll come sniffing. Ain't no one lets property walk away without a fight." Eliza froze, her blood running cold. Property. The word struck her like a slap. She gripped the edge of the shelf until her knuckles whitened, willing herself not to react, not to give herself away. Jacob noticed the shift in her posture immediately. His eyes narrowed, following her gaze toward the men. They were strangers to him, but the words they spoke gnawed at him. He paid for the supplies quickly, motioned for Eliza to follow, and led her out into the bright midday sun. The ride back to the ranch was tense. Eliza sat rigid on the wagon bench, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the road, though his mind churned with questions. He had no right to pry. She had shared so little of her past, but the look in her eyes told him enough. Whoever she had fled from, they would not stop easily. When they finally reached the ranch, Jacob unloaded the supplies in silence. He could feel Eliza's fear, though she tried to mask it with steady movements. Finally, he broke the quiet. "They were talking about you," he said, his tone low, almost cautious. "Those men in town." Eliza's shoulders stiffened, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a trembling breath, she whispered, "I thought maybe they wouldn't follow me this far." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Jacob didn't press her for details. He could see the shame and fear in her eyes. But he also knew, with sudden clarity, that danger was no longer an abstract possibility. It was a shadow stretching across his ranch, threatening not only the fragile peace they had built, but also the life of the girl who had knocked on his door, begging for nothing more than a plate of food. That night, as the wind howled across the plains and the barn creaked in the darkness, Jacob sat awake by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall. The ranch had been a lonely fortress for years, but now, for the first time, he felt its vulnerability. He knew the men would come. The only question was when, and as he glanced toward the loft where Eliza slept, Jacob silently vowed, when they did, they would find him standing in their way. The night was restless. A storm had rolled in from the west, bringing with it a chorus of wind and thunder that rattled the shutters and sent the horses in the barn into uneasy stomps. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, the lantern casting a dim circle of light over the wood grain. His rifle rested against the wall within easy reach. He told himself it was for coyotes or wolves, but he knew the truth. He was waiting, listening, preparing for men. Eliza lay awake in the loft above, staring into the dark. Each rumble of thunder pulled her deeper into memories she had tried desperately to bury. The voices of the men in town echoed in her mind. Belonged, property, paid for. The words made her skin crawl. She had run far, endured hunger and cold, just to escape those chains, yet they still seemed to reach for her. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she crept down the narrow stairs. Her steps were light, but Jacob's head lifted the moment she appeared, his sharp instincts honed by years of solitude. His eyes softened slightly when he saw it was her, clutching her shawl around her shoulders like armor. "You should be sleepin'," he said, his voice low, steady as the storm outside. "I can't," she admitted, her words trembling. She hovered near the edge of the table, uncertain if she had the right to sit. I need to tell you something," Jacob gestured to the chair across from him. She slid into it slowly, her hands twisting in her lap. For a long moment, she struggled to find words. Finally, in a voice barely louder than the rain, she began. "They sold me," she whispered. "My own kin." The words hung heavy between them. Jacob's brows furrowed, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "My father, he drank more than he worked. My brothers weren't much better. When the money ran out, they found another way." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "They signed me over like I was a mule or a sack of grain. Said it was for my keep. Said I should be grateful." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as though ashamed of the truth spilling out. Jacob's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists against the table. "The man they sold me to. He was cruel," she went on. "I cooked, I cleaned, I worked till my hands bled. And still it wasn't enough. He said I owed him more, that I belonged to him. I couldn't stand it. So one night I ran. I've been running ever since." The storm outside seemed to echo her confession, a flash of lightning illuminating her pale face. She looked at Jacob then, her eyes brimming with tears but also defiance. "I never wanted to be a burden to anyone. That's why I asked to work for food. I wanted to be useful, to earn enough to keep breathing." Jacob's chest ached at her words. He saw not just desperation in her, but strength, the kind forged by suffering and survival. She had endured betrayal most men could never imagine, yet here she sat, holding herself upright despite the weight of it all. For a long moment, he didn't trust himself to speak. His voice, when it came, was rough with emotion. "You're no burden," he said firmly. "Not here. Not to me." Her eyes widened at his words, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to believe them. A single tear slid down her cheek, but her lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile as dawn. Jacob leaned back, staring at the flames in the hearth. Anger boiled in his veins. Anger at the men who had claimed her, at the family who had cast her aside, at the injustice of it all. But alongside the anger was a steely resolve. Whatever danger lay ahead, he would not let her fall back into their hands. That night, as the storm raged, Eliza's confession bound them together in a new way. She had entrusted him with her darkest truth, and in doing so had given Jacob a responsibility he did not take lightly. She was no longer just a wanderer at his door. She was someone worth protecting, someone whose fight had become his own. The morning after Eliza's confession, the storm had cleared, leaving the land washed clean beneath a pale blue sky. Dew clung to the grass, and the barn smelled of damp hay and earth. But inside Jacob Callahan, no sense of renewal came. He was weighed down by the choice pressing against his chest, a choice that would shape both their lives. He moved through his chores with deliberate slowness, his mind not on the cattle or the fences, but on the young woman working alongside him. Eliza moved quietly, her head bowed as she swept the barn aisle. But Jacob noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the horizon as though expecting pursuers to crest the hills at any moment. Her confession from the night before replayed in his mind in painful detail. Sold by her own kin, treated as property, hunted for daring to claim her freedom. Jacob's jaw clenched at the thought, his calloused hands curling into fists. He had buried his heart for years, convinced there was no place left for tenderness in his life. But now, anger and protectiveness surged through him in equal measure. By midday, he knew what weighed most heavily on him. If he let her stay, the men who claimed her would eventually find their way to Hollow Creek. He had seen enough of those types, cruel, greedy men who believed the world owed them obedience. They would bring violence to his doorstep, threaten the ranch he had bled for, and possibly destroy the fragile peace he had built. But if he sent her away, if he told her to keep running, what would become of her? He imagined her walking alone across the vast, empty plains, hunger gnawing at her belly, fear dogging her every step. He imagined her falling into the wrong hands again, her spirit crushed until no spark of hope remained. The thought made his stomach turn. He paused by the fence line, staring out at the wide sweep of his land. Clara's voice seemed to whisper to him through memory. "Jacob, don't harden so much that you forget mercy." Clara had always been the gentler soul, the one who took in stray animals, who offered food to drifters passing through, who reminded him that strength meant little without compassion. Turning back toward the house, Jacob spotted Eliza kneeling by the garden, pulling weeds from the soil with quiet determination. Her hair had slipped loose from its braid, catching the sunlight in strands of gold. She looked up just then, catching his gaze, and in her eyes he saw both fear and something else. Trust. Fragile, hesitant, but unmistakable. That trust sealed his decision. That evening, after supper, Jacob set his plate aside and met her gaze across the table. "Eliza," he said, his voice steady though his heart pounded, "you've told me your story, and I believe you. Those men may come looking, and when they do, it'll bring trouble." Her hands tightened around her cup, her eyes dropping as though bracing for the words she feared most, that he would send her away. But Jacob leaned forward, his tone firm, resolute. "If they come, they'll find me standing in their way. You're not running anymore. Not from them, not from anyone. Not while you're under my roof." Eliza's head lifted slowly, disbelief mingling with relief. "You'd do that? Risk everything? For me?" Jacob held her gaze. "It ain't about risk. It's about right and wrong. No man has a claim on you. Not while I've got breath in me." Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back. For the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders seemed to ease, the crushing weight of fear lightening if only a little. Later, as Jacob checked the locks on the doors and placed his rifle by the hearth, he knew the choice would cost him. There would be blood, maybe loss. But he felt no regret. For the first time in years, his life carried purpose again, not just to keep the ranch alive, but to protect someone who needed him. It was a rancher's choice, born of grit and conscience. And Jacob Callahan had made it. The peace that Jacob and Eliza had found was short-lived. It was barely a week after Jacob had made his choice when the first signs of trouble stirred on the horizon. It started with the dogs. They barked furiously one evening, long before nightfall, their sharp barks carrying urgency. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, his rifle slung across his arm, and squinted into the distance. Dust rose in the west, a small cloud moving steadily toward the ranch. His gut tightened. Dust like that didn't come from a lone rider. Eliza appeared in the doorway behind him, her apron still dusted with flour from the bread she had been kneading. "What is it?" she asked, her voice thin with dread. Jacob didn't answer right away. He counted the shadows moving in the haze. 3, 4, 5 riders. His jaw hardened. "Company," he muttered, "and not the kind we want." By the time the riders drew near, The sky was streaked with the orange glow of sunset. Jacob recognized the leader instantly. A stocky man with a crooked nose, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a smirk that never touched his cold eyes. This was the kind of man who believed the law bent to his will. "Well, well," the man drawled, reining in his horse just outside the gate. "Callahan, ain't it? Heard you've been harboring what don't belong to you." Eliza stiffened at the words, stepping back, but Jacob reached behind him and squeezed her hand briefly before letting go. His voice carried across the yard, calm but edged like a knife. "No one here belongs to you?" The man chuckled, though there was no mirth in it. "That girl there, she was promised, paid for. Paper signed and sealed. You keeping her here? That's theft, plain and simple. And I don't take kindly to thieves." Jacob's grip tightened on the rifle, though it remained lowered. "You best turn around and ride back the way you came. You've got no claim here." The man's smile faded, replaced by a sneer. He leaned forward in the saddle. "You got guts, Callahan, I'll give you that. But guts don't change the fact that she's mine." At that, Eliza found her voice. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, though her hands trembled. "I'm not yours. Not now, not ever." Her voice rang clear, slicing through the thick evening air. "You can wave papers, you can shout claims, but I am no man's property." The ranch hands, two boys who worked the fields part-time, stood frozen nearby, watching with wide eyes. The air was taut, waiting for Jacob's move. He raised his rifle then, not to fire, but to show he meant every word he spoke. "She stays," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "And if you think you're taking her, you'll have to go through me first." A tense silence followed, broken only by the stamping of horses and the whine of wind through the fence posts. The leader's eyes narrowed, calculating. He wasn't used to defiance. But he also knew Jacob Callahan's reputation. Quiet, steady, a man who never bluffed. Finally, the man spat into the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled. "You can play hero for now, but we'll be back. And when we come, you won't stand a chance." He wheeled his horse around. The others following, and within minutes the riders were a dark smear against the setting sun. Only when the dust settled did Jacob lower his rifle. His heart thundered, though his face betrayed nothing. Eliza stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "They'll come back, won't they?" Jacob looked at her, then back at the fading horizon. "Yes," he admitted. "And next time they won't be looking to talk." The reckoning had begun, and Jacob knew it would take every ounce of grit, cunning, and strength he had to see them through what was coming. The days that followed the confrontation were thick with tension. Every sound on the wind seemed sharper, every shadow on the horizon a possible threat. Jacob rose earlier than usual, patrolling the fence lines, checking his rifle, making sure the horses and cattle were secure. Eliza worked alongside him, her quiet determination masking the fear she carried. Neither spoke much about the riders, but both knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. That time came sooner than expected. It was dawn when Jacob heard the faint thunder of hooves. He stood on the porch, the morning light painting the land gold, and saw them. More riders this time, at least a dozen. Their leader was there, the crooked-nosed man, his smirk replaced with a grim look that promised trouble. They came fast, dust trailing behind them like a storm cloud. Jacob's pulse quickened, but he felt no panic. He had been preparing for this. He called out to Eliza, who emerged from the barn, her face pale but resolute. "Stay inside," he told her, his voice steady. "No matter what happens," she shook her head, fear sparking in her eyes but mingled with something stronger. "I won't hide, Jacob, not anymore. I'm done running." For a moment he wanted to argue, to insist on shielding her, but the fire in her gaze told him she would not bend. And strangely, it gave him strength. The riders closed in, circling the yard with shouts and jeers. The leader dismounted, swaggering forward as though he already owned the place. "Told you we'd be back," he barked. "Hand her over, Callahan, and maybe we'll leave your ranch standing." Jacob stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand. His voice cut through the air like steel. "You ain't taking her." "Not today. Not ever." The man's face twisted in fury. "Then you've chosen your grave." He signaled to his men, and chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the morning stillness. Horses screamed, chickens scattered, and dust rose in choking clouds. Jacob moved with the calm precision of a man who had lived through loss and refused to live through it again. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, each shot deliberate. A few riders fell, others pulled back, surprised by the ferocity of his defense. But Jacob was only one man. They pressed harder, circling to flank him. That's when Eliza emerged from the house, not with fear, but with resolve. She carried the old revolver Jacob had given her days before, her hand steady despite the danger. She took cover by the woodpile, her eyes sharp. And when one of the men charged toward the porch, she pulled the trigger. The shot rang true, and the man fell. The tide began to shift. The ranch hands, emboldened by Eliza's courage, joined the fight with pitchforks and shotguns. The attackers, expecting an easy claim, found themselves outmatched by determination they hadn't counted on. Finally, the leader found himself face to face with Jacob in the yard. Dust swirled around them, both men breathing hard. The leader sneered, raising his pistol, but Jacob was faster. His shot struck true, and the man crumpled into the dirt. His reign of cruelty ended in a single heartbeat. The remaining riders, shaken and leaderless, fled into the open plains, their threats carried away on the morning wind. Silence settled over the ranch, broken only by the labored breaths of those who remained. Jacob lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes scanning for Eliza. She stood near the woodpile, the revolver still in her hand, her face pale but alive with fierce relief. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. The battle was over, but the weight of it lingered between them. Finally, Eliza crossed the yard, her steps unsteady but determined. She looked at Jacob with tears brimming in her eyes. "You stood for me," she whispered, "when no one else ever did." Jacob reached out, brushing the dust from her cheek with a rough, gentle hand. "You deserve standing for," he said simply. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the battered ranch. It wasn't the end of hardship, not for Jacob, not for Eliza, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something more than survival stirring in his chest. Hope. And for Eliza, the girl who had once begged for food in exchange for labor, it was the dawn of freedom, the first true taste of belonging. Together they stood at the edge of a new day,